Hi, my name is Britt Adams, and you are being brought professional development by Canyon Professional Development with GCU. Today, we're going to be talking about restorative practices and a few things in detail with restorative practices, kind of what are they, how do they apply to us in the classroom, what are some ways that we can modify or adjust behaviors, and kind of what are some fun and interactive ways that we can utilize circles. My name is Britt Adams, like I mentioned. I am a former elementary education teacher. Currently, I work for the Arizona Department of Education. I'm an education program specialist, particularly on the ESSER team. So I help with all of those lovely ESSER grants that we've been working with for the last couple of years. I'm also a restorative practices trainer with IIRP, and that's the International Institute of Restorative Practices. I want to start with a quote from Dr. Bruce Perry, a very well-known researcher and lecturer and author on restorative practices, and particularly works with trauma, childhood trauma, and ACEs. And the quote is, "Connection to healthy people is a buffer against stressors." And I like to start with this quote because I think we all have stressors that come at us in our life, and the school system, the classroom's no different. And I think when we remind ourselves that really it just takes connection and connection to healthy people to kind of create buffers against some of those life stressors. And so connection is a super important part of connecting with kids and being able to navigate tough behaviors and to be able to make progress socially and emotionally with students, which then impacts academic success. So I really like this quote, and I think it really sums up kind of the whole purpose of restorative practices, is to really focus on how are we building relationships and how are we creating deeper connections, and how are we becoming healthier people to be able to kind of provide that type of connection for our students. So right now we're going to start with an activity, and this activity is called What's in Your Pocket. I love this activity. I actually learned it in a training session, a restorative practices training session, and it was brought up by an individual who was an assistant principal and used this activity in every staff meeting. And I thought, what a really cool way to kind of start a staff meeting. This is also applicable for any groups. You could use it with students in your team level meetings and staff meetings, in any way that makes sense for your building. So right now I want you to take out this piece of paper, and I want you to, on the back side of it, the blank side, I want you to just write on it what's ailing you today. And it could be the very first thing that comes to your mind. It could be physical, it could be mental, it could be emotional, spiritual, it could be financial, just anything. What is that first thing that pops up into your mind of just sort of what is taking up space for you today? I'm going to give you a couple minutes, and we'll just kind of write on the back of that paper. This is an anonymous quick write, so please don't put your name on it. And just take a few moments to kind of think through what first pops up in your mind. What is that thing that's ailing you, that's taking up space for you? Okay, finish up what you're writing. And then what I want you to do is I want you to just fold that paper in half with the writing on the inside of the paper. So just fold it directly in half. And I'm going to come around and I'm going to collect all of those pieces of paper. And then I'm going to redistribute them. Now, if you get your own, please, flag me, raise your hand, and let me know, and I'll come back around and pass out a different one to you. So you should not have your quick write. You should have somebody else's quick write. Okay, so if we were in person, this activity, we'd be sitting in a circle and we would be holding somebody else's what's in your pocket. What's the thing that they're carrying that's kind of preventing them from being able to really totally focus. And we would go around the circle and we would each read what is ailing the people in the room. And the goal of this activity is really just to provide context for kind of what people carry around with them, and how some of us have really kind of deep and intense things. Some of us are just we have a lot of homework to grade, or we have this, or sometimes it's really light and sometimes it's really heavy. But I think the goal of the activity is to just remind yourself that everyone has something different they're carrying that's preventing them from being fully present. And what I've noticed with this activity is that, one, it just provides some like empathy in the room to kind of really start to connect with each other on like, wow, we have a lot of things that are going on in everyone's lives. But two, I think writing it down and actually just kind of setting it aside and setting it in a space, just the act of doing that can kind of free you up to be able to be like, okay, I've kind of put that in its place and now I'm going to move forward and focus. So this could be really a great little check-in activity for your students also. It's just kind of like, what's the thing that's, you're thinking about the most today, or what's the thing that you're really worried about, or some of those things, and just do quick writes, and getting it out on paper can help kind of just free up that ability to really engage and focus. Okay, so like I said, some of the objectives and goals that we're going to work on today is we're going to just talk about what are restorative practices, like what are they? We hear the word tossed around, and sometimes you'll hear the word restorative justice. And so we're just going to kind of talk about what are they and how are those two words kind of different, or how are they the same? We're going to dive into relationships and really what makes relationships healthy. We talk about connection to healthy adults, but what does the word healthy mean? And then we're going to go into some discipline styles. And I want to really kind of focus on this idea of this like warm demander. And so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of dissect some different discipline styles. And then I'm going to ask you guys to kind of really reflect on your own personal style, and kind of how that may contribute to the culture climate of the classroom. And then lastly, we're going to talk about circles and how they can be used for relationship building, but also for self-care for you as an educator. Okay, so what is restorative practices? Restorative practices is an emerging social science that studies how to strengthen relationships between individuals, as well as social connections within communities. Now, this is super important. We spend tons and tons of time in our classrooms. We spend tons and tons of time with our families, and we have to figure out as a school and as a family and as an individual, how do we connect to the community at large? How do we connect to where we live, or to our state, or to our country? And so really the goal of restorative practices is to really just sort of strengthen those relationships between kind of all of those moving parts. So we have this range of practices that kind of fall within restorative practices. And there's really sort of on the light end, there's these proactive practices, and then you kind of move on this scale to this right side, this restorative justice piece. And restorative practices are really anything that kind of fall within that range. So we're going to focus a lot today on the proactive practices. The restorative justice is really a much more intense and more detailed practice that really comes after you've been implementing some of the proactive practices. And restorative justice, oftentimes we really see this playing out more at the secondary level in high schools, as a really a kind of a response to kind of harm. And so we spend time on the proactive practices in our younger and our elementary and middle school classrooms to really try to prevent this need for restorative justice in the high schools. So today we're going to kind of focus a lot on the proactive practices, and we'll touch on the restorative justice, but for the most part, the proactive practices are going to be our main focus. So we're going to talk about effective statements and questions. What are those? How do we use those? We're going to talk about small impromptu conversations, and we're going to talk about proactive circles and really what those could look like in the classroom or in your school buildings as a whole. And then we're just going to, kind of continue to dive into this idea of relationship building and what that looks like. Sometimes the relationship building can be a difficult thing to discuss between teacher and student, because we kind of feel like there's this line where the authority, where the teacher, how do we build meaningful connections with students and maintain appropriate boundaries? And so we'll just kind of touch on those things as we kind of move through the presentation. So affective statements and affective questions are kind of really the basis of restorative practices. It's really changing the language, changing the way that we speak to start to include or involve an emotion or feeling into the language that we're using. Effective statements are things, feedback or things that we're giving to students. Effective questions are when we're really trying to elicit responses from them. And what we want to try to do is we want to take language that we're already doing with students. We're already speaking to students all day. We want to change those into just statements that really don't involve any emotion or feeling. And we want to kind of try to shift them into allowing students to understand that their actions create responses and they can impact emotions in other people. And then we also want to sort of try to pull that out of them as reasons for why they may be behaving in certain ways. So we'll go through some activities to kind of practice some of these things, but that's really all it is it's really just taking the things you're already saying to students and making sure that you're involving an emotion or feeling into the language. So affective statements, the goal of these is they set boundaries. So what they are doing is they're providing feedback to a student that says what is acceptable or not acceptable, or what you like or don't like, or what they need to keep doing or stop doing. But it's done in a way that allows them to understand how their actions are impacting you, or how what they're doing or not doing is making you feel, so that there's some type of connection or attachment to the fact that their behavior is affecting other people. And with that, with kind of providing that feedback and setting those boundaries, we're teaching empathy. We're teaching them how to kind of learn to feel and understand their impact, and how to also in turn be able to start thinking of how others impact them and be able to kind of provide some language around those feelings that they might have. So affective statements involve feelings. So instead of saying things like, please get your homework done, you can say, I feel proud of you when I notice that you've completed all your homework, or I feel happy when you responded to your elbow partner in a considerate and kind way, or I'm frustrated when I see you not paying attention when I'm trying to give instruction during class time. So it's instead of just saying like, please stop disrupting me, or please stop, whatever it is that they're doing, it's really switching the conversation to how it's making you feel when that student or when that colleague or when that administrator is doing something that's really, it's making you feel something, but you're not communicating that feeling. You're just communicating the irritation or the behavior or what you're wanting to stop. And so you're really wanting to try to provide more kind of in-depth feedback for the person. So we'll spend some time practicing that. I want you to kind of turn with your elbow partner and practice kind of just making some statements, maybe some typical statements that you tend to use in the classroom a lot, and see how you can kind of shift those to include a feeling word or an emotion word. So we'll take just a couple minutes and you'll work with your elbow partners and practice using some affect in your language. Okay, I hope that went well for you guys. Sometimes it's really difficult to kind of start thinking through. You probably do it intuitively a lot. And if you're not doing it, then it can be kind of challenging to just be mindful about how to add those words in a way that feels authentic for you. And I would say as well, consider the age level, of the students that you're teaching, and you can mirror language that they're using. Even slang language sometimes can really be impactful as long as you're using it in a way that a student understands. Because sometimes in middle school it might feel very awkward or uncomfortable to tell a student, I feel happy when or I'm really frustrated when you. They might kind of, it might just feel awkward. So sometimes even saying like, I am triggered when like kids understand that kind of language, and it's okay to use that. And I would say just make sure that there's a shared definition of those terms, so that when you're saying something, they know what you mean by it and vice versa. But it's really just wanting to get at the fact that there's an effect that's happening with a behavior, and you're wanting to communicate that. So effective questions virtually get at the same kind of thing, but you're really wanting to elicit a response from the student or from a colleague or however you're using these. So you're really wanting them to have like an open-ended type of question to elicit some emotion from the students. They also can allow students the space to explore that issue in a really non-threatening way. And they can be, responsibly used to explore harm and how that harm impacted others. So we'll go through kind of a couple of examples. So if they're used to help somebody that was harmed by another person's actions, what we want to do is we want to allow the person who was affected to have a chance to kind of say how they felt. I think sometimes in schools we focus on the disciplinary action. So we're focusing on the student that has kind of done harm. And what we want to do is we also want to offer the student that was harmed a chance to sort of be able to verbalize how they were impacted. So some questions might be, what did you think when you realized what had happened? And then you kind of wait and give them a chance to really think through and respond. What impact has this incident had on you and others? Maybe it was a bullying incident and there were 2 or 3 students or 4 students or a group of students or half the class or whatever. What's been the hardest thing for you? Sometimes this is really like student maybe thought that person was their friend and they're not only dealing with the bullying action, but dealing with that sort of thought of losing a friend, or that maybe they weren't as important to that person as they thought they were. So there might be some real, some deeper things or additional things that we might not realize have impacted them. And then this last one, what do you think needs to happen to make things right? This is a really important question to ask because sometimes it's really simple. Sometimes kids want an apology. Sometimes they just want a chance to like share their feelings and they don't need anything from the other person per se. They just wanted a chance to they want to make sure that student knows how they felt. So I think this is a really key thing to ask. And you'll notice when we go to the next slide that this is asked also to the person who has done the offense, who has been the offender. What do you think needs to happen to make it right? With restorative practices, what we're always wanting to do is to create opportunities for there to be a restorative action that gets to take place when there's been harm done. So this is a really important question. Okay, so if they're being used to respond to challenging behavior, so this is the person has done the challenging behavior or harmed someone in some way. You're asking virtually the same questions. What happened? Like just allow them an opportunity to explain what it is that happened. What were you thinking at the time? Oftentimes, what we find with these responses is that there wasn't a lot of thought. It was a very impulsive action. So it allows them after the chance to be able to come back and say, like, I honestly didn't think, I wasn't thinking, because if I would have been, I wouldn't have, right? A lot of times it's not, malicious. It's like they're impulsive. So allowing them an opportunity to say, what was it that you were thinking at the time? What have you thought about since then? So allowing them to really think through, well, in the moment, this is what I was thinking, but now this is what I'm thinking. And then asking them who's been affected by your actions. They might not even realize how their behavior or actions affected anyone. They might the discipline solely focused on them. So they're just kind of in their own little world thinking about themselves. But this is really important because it allows them to also be able to say, okay, well, I did it and I'm getting in trouble, but I also hurt someone else, or I also affected the learning of my classmates, or I also, kind of created, some feelings, some not good feelings between me and my teacher, or whatever. So who's been affected by your actions and in what way? And then this last question, what do you think needs to happen to make things right? Oftentimes they come up with their own solutions, their own things, and sometimes it's way more intense than maybe what the person who was offended needed. So it's kind of interesting to give both sides an opportunity to really kind of discuss that. Okay, so affect is really just about kind of shifting the language that we're using. If you're already including affect in the language when you're speaking with students, awesome, keep doing it, and really just kind of think through, am I providing feedback? Am I setting boundaries? And am I really teaching empathy with my language? And if the answers to all those things are yes, awesome. If you're not doing that, or if that hasn't even been something you've thought about, then this is a great opportunity. Maybe start with one or the other. Maybe start with affective statements first, and maybe pick 2 or 3 that you feel like, okay, I'm gonna try these 2 or 3, and then when those start to become more natural and more comfortable, then maybe add a few more. Or maybe you start with the questions first. Maybe those feel a little less scary to you because you're not the one having to, create that effective language. You're asking somebody else to do it. It doesn't really matter. Just start with whatever you feel like you're comfortable starting with. And it's okay to start slow. So just take chunks of things that you feel like you can implement and start those. And as you get comfortable, add more. So let's dive into healthy relationships. This is a really interesting section of my restorative practices trainings, because what I find is that really this this sort of like definition of a healthy relationship can vary really widely. So what I want to do is I want to spend a little bit of time just kind of going through, like, what do healthy relationships sound like? What do they look like? What do they feel like? Kind of like what are they? What makes up a healthy relationship? So right now we're going to just take a few minutes. We're going to work with that same elbow partner. And what I want you to do is just kind of connect on each of you, kind of take an opportunity to kind of share your thoughts. What do healthy relationships sound like? Let's start with that one. We'll just take a minute or two. What do they sound like? So auditorily, when I'm hearing something that sounds like a healthy relationship, what would that sound like? Okay, couple minutes. Okay, awesome. I hope you had a chance to really both partners were able to share what they felt like a healthy relationship sounded like. We're going to do the same thing, and we're going to do it with this idea of what a relationship looks like. So if I'm watching a healthy relationship, maybe I'm a people observing, I'm sitting on a bench in a park, I'm at the mall, whatever, or I'm, thinking back to my parents' relationship, or colleague or best friend's relationship. What does that relationship look like that makes me feel like it's healthy? And again, let's have both partners have time to share. So we'll take a couple of minutes. Okay, and then our last section that I kind of want to do the same thing is, what do they feel like? This is going to be more from your own personal experience. What do healthy relationships feel like? How do we feel when we know that we're in a relationship with someone that's healthy for us, that we feel like if there's positive, it's good? What does that feel like to us? And again, both partners have a chance to contribute. We'll take just a couple minutes. Okay, so if this session was in person, we again would be in a circle, and we'd really kind of break up and have our partner talk, and then we come back together and we have a really like a whole group discussion. And I kind of would ask and solicit responses from the group in terms of what those things like looked like, sounded like, felt like. And one of the things that's always really interesting in this section is that there's a really wide variety of responses. What seems healthy to some person might not seem that healthy to others, or maybe there's just like things that you would never think about that like could be considered healthy. And so this always brings up this really great conversation about cultural differences. And culturally, there's different behaviors and actions that are very common and really part of a norm that might be really offensive or disrespectful or feel really invasive to others. And so this is something that kind of can create, an interesting dialogue when you're really trying to define, what does the healthy relationship look like, sound like, feel like, and how do we as a group, how do we as a classroom, how do we as a school community really put a definition around a healthy relationship while making spaces for those cultural differences? An example might be, if I'm in a healthy relationship, I feel like when I communicate to somebody, I want them to look me in the eye. I want them to be very, engaged with me and know that they're listening to me. And then we kind of get into the conversation. Well, okay, in some cultures, eye contact is very uncomfortable or seen as disrespectful or really not appropriate. And so are we taking that into consideration when we are in a relationship with someone that really views that as not good? This also maybe brings up for our student population that has autism. Eye contact might not be possible, or it might look different. Does that mean that the relationship's not healthy? So this is a really, really important part of defining kind of what this healthy means in our relationships. And so what I want to do is I want to just take a few moments. This is going to be a self-write, and I want you to kind of think through and be self-reflective of your own biases. And what do you have in you, maybe from your upbringing, maybe just from, experiences as an adult? What do you have in you that is like a bias that you think impacts the way you engage in your relationships? Do you have anything that just sticks out that you can't get past, that you feel like impacts every way you relate to somebody or way, whether or not you're willing to engage with them. So let's take a few minutes and let's just kind of write down maybe a few biases you have about people. There are a few biases. You're not going to have to share this with anybody. This is your own personal self-reflection. It's really just about being aware and present and kind of, what we bring into our classrooms and what we bring into our relationships. So let's just identify a couple. One or two is fine. What biases do you have? Okay, once you've identified a couple of biases, and these could be easy, like, I don't know, here's an easy example. I feel like everyone with tattoos is a little rough around the edges. Okay, that could be a bias, or you're stereotyping something and it's creating an unintended way of engagement, right? You're not meaning to, but it's just in there. So we're going to further our self-reflection here a little bit. And I want you to think through, maybe with those biases in mind, maybe there's something a little deeper now that we've kind of been thinking about it a little longer. How does your language and vocabulary send certain unintended messages? Okay, I'm going to read that again. How does your language and vocabulary send certain unintended messages? And I'll just give a few minutes for that, right? Think through just your personally, how does your language, your vocabulary, how does it send certain unintended messages? Okay, if we were in person and we were in a whole group, I would ask for anyone willing to share any of their biases or any ways that they can think of that their language or vocabulary sends certain unintended messages. And then I would really allow for conversation. A lot of times what happens is when you have someone vulnerable enough to want to share some of those things, it'll break open other people and the conversation begins to really kind of take shape. And the cool part with things like this is that you're modeling for students what it's like to have healthy discourse around various topics. So of course, this might not be a topic you'd use in the classroom. It might be, but whatever it is that you decide to use kind of in your circle times in your classrooms, you can really use it to create healthy discourse and teach students what it's like to have healthy discourse. So we would have a much, larger and deeper conversation around these self-reflections. And sometimes no one's willing to share, and that's okay too. Then the conversation is done, right? But oftentimes people are really, and students are the same, are really willing to share their thoughts about things. And it really can open up the viewpoints of others and really widen the lenses of people contributing to those discussions. It's really cool. Okay, we're going to jump into behavior. And this is going to be kind of feel like a little bit of a weird section in this training, because really the training's not on, I'm not a behavior specialist, I'm not a counselor, I'm not any of those things. So I'm not going to spend too much time diving into the sort of like, sciences behind all of these things. But it does have an impact on the classroom, of course, and it does have an impact oftentimes on our discipline styles. And it is kind of an interesting thing when we start talking about like school-wide discipline and how do we make school-wide discipline more restorative. So I'm going to just kind of camp out on this for just a few minutes. In order to have healthy connection, we have to be healthy people, right? We have to understand behavior, and we have to understand like what is coming into our classrooms. And we as educators know all of the things that our students are dealing with oftentimes. I mean, we have everything from homelessness to food insecurity to, abusive homes to any number of things, right? I mean, our students are faced with so many things that are trauma, and they affect learning. So this is not anything, I'm not going to tell you anything you don't know here, but here's what I want to kind of focus on is that we need to understand how our behavior as educators can maybe trigger students, can maybe be causing some of these triggers that are creating this sort of like behavior issues in the classroom. And then from there, what are we doing to reintegrate those students back into a like healthy learning environment once they've had kind of an outburst or a behavior issue, or they've been sent out of the classroom? So that's really what I want to focus on, is like understanding our involvement in it. And then what are we doing to reintegrate students? We can't control students, and we can't control the things that impact their lives. They're coming to our classrooms with these things, whether we like them or not. So this section of the presentation is really not focused on any of that. But what I want to kind of look at on this little kind of chart on the right is that look how early the trigger happens in a behavior. I mean, we have this sort of like normal zone, and then if that trigger happens like so quickly, and by the time they're up into this dysregulation zone, that's when we're trying to deal with their behavior. And then we see how that goes, right? That's usually like they're out of the classroom, or there's a safety issue, or we're having, I mean, it's usually very problematic by the time a student's dysregulated. Learning's disrupted for sure, right? And then this sort of calming down back to normal, this 4 and 5, is really where administration gets the students. And so this creates kind of a vicious cycle for educators and students, is that we have the relationship in the classroom with them, and we're really wanting to try to create connection so that we can all learn and be successful in this, classroom community. We are going to have to deal with behavior issues and students getting into this dysregulation zone. And then administrators get to have them when they're calming down and coming back to normal. And so oftentimes their relationship to administrators gets deeper and stronger quicker. And then we create this sort of like the kid wants to get out of the class because they have a better connection, a relationship to the school counselor, the administrator, the dean of students, principal, whoever it is that they're meeting with. And then what happens is that the student does whatever it is they have to do for the behavior of the school, whatever that discipline system is. And then they come back into the classroom, and then what? So I think this conversation really is to say, understand the triggers of your students to the best of your abilities. And the only way we can do that is to know what they've got going on. The only way we know what they've got going on is if we're being intentional about building meaningful connections with them. And then understand, be self-reflective as an educator to know what you're adding or not adding to the classroom that may be impacting those triggers. And then take it a step further and go, okay, they've been dysregulated, they've left the classroom, administration's done their part. Now, what are we doing to make that student feel welcome back in the classroom after they've just disrupted the learning of everyone in there? Do they have an ability of how they've impacted their classmates? Do they have awareness of how they impacted you personally? And this goes back to those affective statements or affective questions, like, are we closing that loop? So what we want to do is we want to allow the student who's disrupted the classroom, disrupted the learning, or had a break in the relationship with the teacher, whatever happened, to pay their consequences for the behavior. This is not like getting out of having consequences, but are we allowing an opportunity for restorative action after that, so that they come back in and feel part of their classroom community again? And is the relationship being repaired with the teacher and the student after there's been a behavior concern or issue? Because if there's not that closing of that loop and repairing that relationship, then oftentimes as an educator, we're just already elevated and irritated, and we might not realize that we just keep triggering students because they already think we don't like them. We kind of don't like them sometimes, and we have a hard time kind of creating that connection again. So that's really kind of what I wanted to focus on for behavior as we kind of move into this discipline style section. So the fundamental hypothesis of restorative practices is that human beings are happier, more cooperative and productive, and more likely to make positive changes in their behavior when those in positions of authority do things with them rather than to them or for them. So I just want to let's just pause and think through that for just a second. If we want students to make positive behavioral changes, they're just more likely to do that when people in positions of authority, so teachers, administrators, do things with them rather than to them or for them. Okay, and I would say this goes for us as adults as well. We're more likely to make positive changes when our administrators, are asking us in ways that make us feel like they're doing it with us rather than it's just being handed to us or told to us. So I think this works for for school systems in general, but we'll kind of keep it focused on the classroom. Okay, so we're going to dive into discipline. This is going to be a little bit of an interesting section, I think, because oftentimes we don't really think about our discipline styles and how those impact the classroom. So we're going to dive into them a little bit deeper. So with the International Institute of Restorative Practices, they have this X and Y axis sort of chart, and it's called the social discipline window. And, on one axis, you have this control, this low to high, and this is like your limit setting, your discipline areas. And then you have this support axis, and it's got, high and low support. So you're encouraging, you're nurturing. And we're going to dive into each of these boxes as we kind of move through the presentation. But so you can kind of see the range of just low support, low control, all the way to high support, high control. Okay. And I'm sure you can guess by the picture, but you're going to want to be focusing on this blue box, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Okay. So these are kind of what's in the boxes. This high control, low support box, this top left box is your 2 box. This is when you're just doing things to kids. You're disciplining them in a way that feels punitive to them. There's nothing that they get to do to engage in it. It's just being handed to them. Even the way that sometimes you can speak to students can feel very punitive. Demands, a lot of demands, not a lot of room for, a response. There's no response. It's just you're being told. And then below that, we have this neglectful, this not box. And you can see it's really low on control and really low on support. So these are teachers that are checked out. There's no control, limit setting, discipline happening. There's also not a lot of support. They just probably either, need a little bit more support as an educator. Maybe they need some additional trainings. Maybe they're in the wrong field. Who knows? There could be any number of reasons why an educator would be in this box. I also want you to think of these not only as you in the classroom, but you at home. If you have children at home, kind of how you are and are they different? Okay. So this neglectful box is this low on both control and support. And then we have this 4 box, this permissive box, and this is super high on support, not a lot of control. These are, you're kind of doing things for kids so that they do well, right? And then there's this with box, and this is the box that really all of us would love to be in all the time, and no one's in this box all the time. So these are, hashtag life goals right here, this with box. So we're going to go through kind of in detail what each box looks like in the classroom. So this high control, low support, this is the punitive, this 2 box. And I hate the word punitive. I'm going to stop using it. I should just actually take it off this slide, but it kind of gives you this picture of just this sort of very demanding. A lot of times classrooms with this type of discipline style have excellent classroom management. You can walk into these classrooms and students are doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. There's high expectations. Like, you wouldn't dream of stepping out of line in these classrooms. Students absolutely comply. And these teachers can be known as the tough teacher. Oh, their class is super hard. Oh, they're this, right? There's just lots of control, maybe not a lot of support. These wouldn't be the teachers that a kid would go to if they needed help, right? It's just like, do the work, do it, or you're going to fail, right? And then we have this sort of high support, low control. So these are your then this 4 box, this permissive box. These are like maybe poor classroom management. Like there's not a lot of structure, but there's support. Like they're the favorite teacher. Kids like them. They're really sweet and fun. But students can kind of be unsure of expectations, like because there's not a lot of limit setting or discipline in there. It's sort of like, am I supposed to do it? Am I not supposed to do it? And oftentimes we see students underperform in classrooms like this. They feel liked and loved and they enjoy their teachers, but academically, there's not a lot of standards, like high standards for those kinds of classrooms. And then we have this low support, low control. So this is the neglectful box that I was referring to earlier. Poor classroom management in here, maybe feels very chaotic. There are no expectations, poor academic standards. And this classroom is really inequitable because without any sort of limit setting, discipline, or support encouragement, like students could be getting a very different response, it could just be very erratic. And so there's a really inequitable way of engaging with students in a classroom like this. It's just kind of like there's no standards. And then let's kind of go into this high control, high support. I want to really make sure that you hear that a restorative classroom does have high control, but they also have high support. And so what that might look like is you have strong classroom management. Students know what's expected of them, and there is an organization in order to that classroom. There's a healthy student-teacher dynamic here. So there are very high expectations, but there's support that goes with that, that there's a relationship that accompanies that control or that limit setting. The high expectations are both academically and socially. So students in these kinds of classrooms are not only expected to do the work, but they're also expected to engage in meaningful conversations and to support their peers and to be respectful and things like that. There's a flexibility from an educator that's meeting the needs of each student. And what this might look like is there's going to be some students in classrooms like this that need a lot more support and less control, and some that will need more control and less support. And you are kind of adjusting to meet the needs of all of those students. So there's an equitable practice in a classroom that's restorative. Before we move too far out of this kind of section, I want to make sure that we understand that we will be in different boxes sometimes throughout the day. And sometimes we are going to have a much more of a high control, no support, because that's what a student needs that we're dealing with. Sometimes we're going to be a little bit more permissive, maybe depending on where we're at in the school year, maybe depending on what else has been happening. We kind of take into consideration what the class needs at that moment. The neglectful box, I can relate to this in a way, it kind of with my own kids, like sometimes I'm just spent, and a neglectful parent in me might be like, I don't care what you do right now. Get on your computer, get on your phone. I just need 10 minutes. Like I might be a neglectful parent in some of those ways sometimes. And so I really want to kind of challenge the thinking that there's good and bad boxes. Because if we're honest with ourselves, we're all in these boxes at various points in our life, at various points in our day, and with various students. The goal is to be in that with box as much as possible. So really start to think about yourself and like, where am I lacking in skills to be able to be successful in these areas? Do I need more work being supportive? Do I need more work being more limit setting or having stronger discipline? So that's really the goal. It's really not to create this sort of good and bad. It's really to sort of say, okay, am I moving through these in a fluid way that's evolving my practice as a restorative practitioner? And am I focusing on trying to do things with my students rather than to them or for them? Okay. So I want to do another self-reflection. I think this is really important for us to really think through, what is our practitioner style? What is our default? So I want to take a few minutes to kind of think through and maybe write down, what's your default? Could just be the one word, the 2 box, the 4 box, the with box, the, neglectful, permissive, punitive. Like, what's your default? What's the one that you go to the quickest? Maybe just take a minute and write that down. Okay, now I want you to think, this is going to take a little bit longer because I want you to think of a recent time when you were in each of the 4 quadrants. And maybe you want to focus this only on you as a parent. Maybe you want to focus you in the classroom. It doesn't really matter. Just think of a time when you were in each of the 4 quadrants. So let's start with maybe the 2 box, the punitive box. When were you really high in control and low in support? Think of a time and maybe describe that quickly on your paper. Okay, let's do the same thing for the permissive box. Think of a time, recently, think of a recent time when you were kind of in that high support, low control. Think of a time when you were in that permissive. When did you just allow something to happen? Okay, let's do the same thing for the not box. When were you neglectful? Think of a recent time when you had a neglectful discipline style. Could be with your kids at home this summer, could be in your classroom recently. Think of a time when you were neglectful. Think of a time when you were in that permissive. When did you just allow something to happen? Okay, for this next part, let's take one of those three sections, because this prompt is going to really kind of push you towards being more in the with box. We're not going to really talk about the time that you're in the with box. So of the punitive, the permissive, or the neglectful box, how did you come to be in that box? You can just choose one of them. What happened that, like, was it just the auto default, or did something really force you to kind of respond in that way? How did you come to be in that box? And maybe kind of describe what triggers or issues pushed you towards that box. Okay, and if you wanted to be more with, if you wanted to move from that neglectful box into the with box, what behavior would you need to change? So this is not about changing the behavior to be better. It's about how did you respond and how could you have responded in a way that was in the with box. So if you wanted to be more with, what behavior would you need to change? Okay, the last section of the presentation is really focused around circles. In an in-person setting, you're experiencing circles throughout the whole training. So this particular section won't really exist in an in-person setting because you're getting them all along. But for the purposes of this training online, we're going to kind of describe some of the different types of circles and how you could use them, and what implementation kind of looks like with circles. So we really have kind of 4 different kinds of circles. We have check-in circles, proactive circles, discourse circles, and restoration circles. So you've experienced, kind of some of these probably already. You might already do them in your classrooms intuitively. You might not know that they were considered necessarily like circles, but you might already be doing them. But if you're not, these are some ways that you can start using them. So check-in circles are quick. They involve emotions or feelings. The what's in your pocket, that's a check-in circle. A check-in circle also could look like, on a scale of 1 to 5, how are you feeling today? 1 means this, 5 means this. Show me your fingers. And so you're getting a reading, a gauge quickly on where everyone's at. Check-in circle could be, use 1 word to describe your weekend. If you could describe your mood as a weather, what would it be? And then 1 by 1, you just kind of go around your circle and you elicit a response from each student. The goal with check-in circles is that they're quick, that they do involve some type of like feeling or emotion, or you're gauging sort of how somebody's doing, but pick prompts that every student can answer. So you can get yourself into trouble with check-in circles if not everyone can participate. The goal is 100% participation, and you will get 100% participation if it's easy for a student to answer and does not require any vulnerability from them. So asking a student, or ask a check-in circle saying, what did you do with your parents this weekend? Not all students live with their parents. So things like that. Just be thoughtful about the language that you're using when you're coming up with prompts. Proactive circles are similar to check-in circles, but they might be a little bit more involved. They might take a little bit more time. So you want to kind of plan accordingly. They're quick, they're fun, they're engaging, and they require participation. They're like check-in circles, but maybe you're wanting to kind of elicit some little bit deeper responses, but still in a fun and engaging way. Maybe you're wanting to figure out kind of what students might have similar interests as other students. You can kind of start to see like maybe where your groupings would be to kind of start to develop some connections with your students. One that's really fun to do is, what's your favorite flavor of ice cream? And oftentimes what you'll find is that you'll have students that have similar likes or dislikes. And so those might be really great ways to start grouping students at the start of the school year. You guys like the same kind of ice cream. Maybe you have more things in common. So you're just wanting to try to create connections with these proactive fun circles. What's another one that might kind of work with something like that? if a genie granted you one wish, what would it be? Or for adults, this is really fun in staff meetings. If you could own any car, regardless of the price, what would it be? And the responses are hysterical. What comes out of people's mouth on what kind of car they would drive is really funny. But what it allows you to do is that it'll allow you to see kind of where some connections can be made. And then those are great starting, places. It also allows for the all of the students or all of the staff that's in the circle to also hear those responses from others. And they themselves start to see, oh, I actually probably have something in common with them. I didn't realize they also liked to do that, or I didn't realize so proactive is just really relationship building. It's fun, and it's trying to create kind of an engaging, proactive way of creating deeper connections. And then you have your discourse circles. So these are where you are going to really work on developing this ability to discuss topics. And kind of a side benefit is they really can teach empathy, because you start to hear differing thoughts and opinions. Discourse circles also are really focused on elevating voice. So what we'd like to try to do is, in restorative practices, we want all voices to be heard and to have the same exact opportunity to engage and to contribute. Now, discourse circles, you may not have 100% participation at first. You might not have 100% participation ever in your school year. Depends on how often you use them and kind of what the prompts are. But these are a really great way for sometimes your students who might never speak up because they're not kind of the most exuberant or loudest or most extroverted in the classroom, eventually will start to share. And that's really powerful for students that typically don't get to speak up. It's also a really great way to sort of quiet your ones that are always talking and always jumping in and kind of providing their thoughts or opinions at first. It really sort of creates a more controlled conversation. The way that I like to do discourse circles is I like to do sequential circles with these, because I feel like with students, especially when you're first starting out, you have to really create some high control around these circles to make sure that everyone gets an opportunity, and that students really understand the process of a circle and kind of what's acceptable and not acceptable in them. And so with a sequential circle, it starts with one, and then it just consistently moves around the circle one by one. And you set up your norms and your expectations in the beginning. And it's just one person talking at a time, and there is no crosstalk or interruptions. So again, it's a process and students have to learn. So it will not feel super clean in the beginning, but just keep focusing the students back to these norms that you create in the beginning. And if you get interruptions and you just remind them, hey, these are the norms in our circles, and you kind of, and over time they will learn. And I think when students begin to engage in them and feel how impactful it feels to be able to have a space and an opportunity to share without being interrupted or criticized or ridiculed or whatever that happens when kids talk sometimes, they become really, really sacred spaces for students. And then you'll be able to really deepen your ability to really talk about a number of topics. You can also use them to really talk about maybe you're starting a lesson and you want to kind of gauge what your students already know. You might do a prompt about the upcoming unit you're getting ready to dive into, and kind of just see what the students already know, what their comfort level is. And that might help you plan kind of what you need to pre-teach before you dive in. So there's a lot of different ways you could use discourse circles. And then we have these restoration circles. And these are your circles that would typically be described as a restorative justice action, a restorative justice conference. These are used when there's been harm done in a relationship and you need to restore harm. Restorative justice conferencing really cannot be done at all if you have not done any of the other things. You couldn't just not have any restorative practices happening in your school and then think that you're going to restorative justice conference students. They don't have the skills, the language, the norms, they have no awareness of circles at all. They won't be effective. But restorative justice conferencing is taking students that were involved in whatever kind of infraction it was, whether you have students that are suspended for fighting, whether there was cyberbullying happening, whether there was, an altercation on recess, that affected whatever. There was harm done to a relationship. These types of conferences are addressing harm that was done, and it's allowing both sides to be able to express their views, their sides, and what they think needs to happen to move forward to be able to restore the relationship. So these are much more intense and much more kind of labor intensive, and they require a lot more planning. With restorative justice conferencing, you always want both the offender and the person who was, I hate the victim, but that's kind of the one on the receiving end and the one that was the doer. You want them both to have support with them. So this could be parents, family, friend, like whatever. You want them both to have support with them when you're conferencing with them. I have seen restoration circles used in elementary schools, of course, but they're not over really intense issues. Maybe it's you're seeing on the playground a specific behavior that continues to happen over and over again. You've told all your students you're not allowed to climb up the slide, you need to use the stairs, and they continue to do it. That could be a reason why you would want to have, maybe a student fell because they were climbing up it backwards and broke their arm. And so now maybe there's this sort of opportunity to circle your classroom up and say, these are the things that happen when we aren't following the school rules. And I'm really frustrated because I asked multiple times and now we have a student that has been hurt, so you're providing an opportunity for a classroom to really kind of talk about what happened, what they were thinking at the time, like, was there a reason we weren't following directions? And you're giving students voice to be able to express, and you're also allowing them to take ownership of things, ownership of the fact that they didn't listen. And you're allowing the student that was harmed or was hurt to be able to kind of share what they think and what they feel. So it doesn't have to always be this sort of extreme restorative justice conferencing, but that's generally how we see it used. But think of that. If you continue to see a similar behavior occurring over and over and over again, you might need a restoration circle. I've seen this with like disruptions in the class. So if a teacher is not able to get through their lessons, there's constant disruptions in the class, maybe it's time to pause and circle the kids up and kind of talk about how the relationship's being harmed between you and your students. You're not able to teach them, and you're spending a lot of time and energy preparing, and you're not getting through your lessons. And they might need to understand on a deeper level than you just saying, please pay attention, or I need to get through this, or I would really appreciate if you'd focus right now. Maybe we need to have a whole group conversation because the learning's being disrupted for the whole community. So those are some different types of circles. Again, if this was in person, we would be really looking at, we'd be looking at all of these kind of in action. We'd be experiencing them throughout the training. But that's kind of like an overview of the different types of circles that you could use. I would say in implementation, pick one. If you haven't used circles at all, I'd start with check-in circles. And maybe just commit to doing check-in circles every morning as kind of the very first thing you start in your day. Or maybe you only have time to do them 2 days a week or on Fridays, or however that looks like for you and your classroom and your school building. Start with check-in circles. They're quick. If you Google check-in circles, check-in activities for circles online, you will have a slew of different prompts that you could use, different ways that you can start having check-in circles be part of your routine. That is the quickest, easiest, and really the kids love it. So that's a great way to start. If you're already using those, maybe kind of deepen your proactive circles and your relationship building, maybe carve out specific time in your week to really kind of do something that starts to just build community a little bit deeper. And then for those of you that have kind of been doing that for a while, maybe that's just part of your routine, maybe kind of dig into discourse circles a little bit and start trying to elevate student voice around different topics. And this one, I just say you have to really be thoughtful about the topics because conversations can go in a million different directions, as you know, with students. And so you really want to kind of set up the expectations of the circle, be careful with your prompts. And then of course, you are a mandatory reporter. So sometimes those discourse circles can be tough because there may be things that come up in them that you will have to report. So I say, the discourse circles are a really, really great way to deepen connection and provide meaningful experiences, but you do have to be very thoughtful about about them. And I would say, don't start using discourse circles until you really feel like you have some really strong norms with your check-in and your proactive circles. Students really respect the circle time. They're engaging, they're doing what they're supposed to, and they're kind of respecting what the circles are and what they mean, and then kind of try to deepen that. Definitely don't dive into discourse circles on your first go. I hope that this provides a little bit of context for restorative practices and how various things kind of go into becoming a restorative practices practitioner. And really, I like to kind of compare it to a yoga practice. Nobody goes into a yoga studio and is able to bend deep into those poses on the first day. It takes a consistent practice. It takes a mindful practice and a willingness to be self-reflective about what's not working, or maybe what needs to shift in you in order to be more restorative. And so I would just really challenge you all to take a look at your practice, commit to something, any small little thing that you feel like feels like you could implement it and it feels like it would feel authentic to you to do. Really commit to just practicing and being consistent with it, and then you'll see the results. Just like in yoga, eventually you'll be able to kind of stretch, into that pose, and you'll see results, and you'll feel really good. So I'd encourage you to really just try this. If you have a team member and a grade level team or in your building that is using restorative practices on some level or circles, reach out and connect and see what's working, what's not working, and really just kind of try to expand practice. It's really just a lens that you're looking through and how you're engaging, relating, bringing emotion in, and just trying some fun and engaging ways to build community and kind of deepen those connections. So I'll take you to this page too. You can scan that QR code and look at all of the fun stuff that Canyon PD has on their YouTube channel. There's tons and tons of free videos. So if you're interested, go ahead and take a screenshot of that, and then you'll have that QR code.